Have you ever truly wondered what it was like to reside within the towering walls of a medieval castle? Not the fairy tale version with singing birds and magical quests, but the raw, unfiltered version, grounded in historical reality, the kind where discomfort, questionable hygiene, and endless drafts were as standard as the stone walls themselves. Forget Hollywood glamour. Castle life wasn't all gleaming armor and lavish feasts. It was a mix of backbreaking labor, dubious medical practices, and daily inconveniences that would drive most modern humans mad within a week. Let's start with waking up. The elite didn't rise with gentle harp music or stretched luxuriously beneath linen sheets. No, they woke up on straw-stuffed sacks, lumpy, musty, and often unchanged since the previous harvest. Medical texts of the time even included remedies for injuries sustained from these primitive beds. That's right, your sleeping surface could quite literally maim you. If you were fortunate, and by that we mean rich, you got your straw lifted slightly off the ground by a wooden frame. But elevation didn't mean comfort. It was the medieval version of sleeping on a wooden bench padded with hay, still scratchy, still rigid, and still capable of giving you splinters in unmentionable places. If you were fortunate, and by that we mean rich, you got your straw lifted slightly off the ground by a wooden frame. But elevation didn't mean comfort. It was the medieval version of sleeping on a wooden bench padded with hay, still scratchy, still rigid, and still capable of giving you splinters in unmentionable places. Castle insulation was a myth. Those thick stone walls were designed to repel armies, not retain heat. They turned your home into a stone refrigerator. Wearing yesterday's clothes to bed wasn't laziness. It was a survival tactic. If you didn't layer up, you risked waking up as a medieval popsicle. Windows, tiny slits in the wall, more useful for loosing arrows at attackers than letting in sunlight. On cloudy days, which was nearly every day in medieval Europe, your bedroom stayed pitch black. Getting out of bed often meant stubbing your toe on a chamber pot or stepping into something wet and mysterious. And yes, expletives were invented for such moments. Hygiene was a whole other battlefield. Your morning face splash came from a bucket of water, so cold it might still contain floating ice. Showers didn't exist. Heating water involved a dangerous dance with fire, and, in one inventive French castle, lead pipes warmed near the kitchen, a design that worked, but also poisoned everyone slowly. Cleanliness, it turns out, had a price. Soap, if you could afford it. You might use Castile soap made with olive oil, so pricey that it cost the same as a sheep. For everyone else, soap meant mixing ashes with fat and hoping for the best. It didn't lather, it smeared. To relieve yourself, you had two options: a chamber pot under the bed, or a vertical toilet called a garderobe, a hole in the wall that doubled as a wardrobe. The smell was so bad that nobles believed it repelled moths. If you had no garderobe, you tossed your chamber pot out the window. After shouting "Guard alow," watch out for the water, which never meant water. City ordinances had to be passed to make sure people at least gave a warning before tossing feces into the streets. Public sanitation, medieval style. As for breakfast, it was a hierarchy-based affair. Nobles got bread, meat, maybe fruit if it was a good day. Servants, boiled mystery vegetable stew known as pottage, served in trenchers, which were basically stale bread bowls. After a few days, these were handed to the poor, who gnawed on them with whatever teeth remained. And you washed it down, not with water, contaminated wells made that risky, but with beer. Even children drank a weak version called small beer. Castles consumed thousands of pints a week, and brewers were practically gods. One bad batch, and the entire castle revolted. Dining involved fingers, not forks. Those were considered weird and foreign. Etiquette included not wiping greasy hands on your beard, advice clearly needed at the time. People fought over seating. One knight challenged another to a duel over sitting closer to the salt, the medieval Wi-Fi of dining privileges. Castle smells were a blend of damp stone, open fires, unwashed humans, animals wandering inside, and the glorious funk of Russia's dried grass strewn over the floors and replaced once a year. Yes, once a year. Layers of old food, animal droppings, and whatever else was tracked and created a scent so rich that even lavender thrown on top couldn't save it. Defense training was daily. Archers practiced shooting arrows through impossibly narrow slits. Guards dumped oil and even beehives on invaders. Spiral staircases twisted clockwise to benefit right-handed defenders. Children threw rotting vegetables at each other in siege roleplay. And yes, the moat was sometimes weaponized with the contents of those charming garderobes. Entertainment jesters who mocked everyone, even the king. Dice games with names like God's Dice. Blindfolded jousting. Musicians forced to play until begged to stop. Lavish feasts with food sculptures. Peacocks redressed in feathers. Castles made of pastry, and marzipan knights riding roast chicken horses. The staff, they worked non-stop. Gong farmers cleaned toilets at night and got paid surprisingly well for it. Cooks prepared 6,000 calories a day per person. The tornbro, often a small child, turned the spit and sometimes passed out, inventing burnt roasts. Guards had to sing on duty. The blacksmith was overworked and annoyed at every noble demanding dragon-shaped doorknobs. Castle ladies, the true CEOs. They managed staff, food stocks, finances, medicine, education, and defense when the Lord went crusading. Their account books listed everything from wasted arrows to bad bread. They even led sieges, healed the sick with herb gardens, and stopped wars with creative illusions involving empty barrels. Medicine, laughable. Treatments included chicken butts on heads for fever, powdered skulls for headaches, and unicorn horns for everything else. Bleeding was the cure-all. Dentistry meant lead fillings or pulling teeth pre-battle, yet somehow, alcohol-based herbal potions sometimes worked, likely by accident. Nights were darker than a blackout. Candles cost a day's wages. Guards mistook armor for demons. Ghost sightings were officially recorded, including critiques of ghost fashion. Tapestries were believed to be alive. Rats read cookbooks, and knights occasionally challenged their reflections to duels. Dungeons, cold, dark, and full of rats, sometimes sold as companions on the invoice. Prisoners paid for their stay. Some brought their own servants. One man was jailed for unpaid cheese. Another opened a tourism business inside his cell. One tried to escape, dressed as his mother, and was caught when she recognized him mid-getaway. And when dawn came again, the whole circus reset, from noble to chambermaid, rooster to jester, all preparing to survive another day in the gloriously grim, occasionally hilarious world of medieval castle life, between unwashed bodies smoking fire pits and assorted animals that had wandered in during the meal. The castle's distinctive aroma was beginning to intensify for the day. Let's begin with the floors. Medieval castle floors were not the pristine stone surfaces depicted in films. They were covered in rushes, essentially medieval carpeting. These rushes were layers of dried grass and herbs spread across the floor. And here's the kicker. They were only completely replaced once a year. Sure, fresh rushes were sprinkled on top every few weeks, but beneath lay a year's accumulation of spilled food, mud, animal droppings, and whatever else landed on the floor. Medieval documents mention that the fresh herbs scattered included lavender and meadowsweet, likely in a desperate attempt to mask the scent of what was effectively a giant compost heap underfoot. The animals contributed their own unique notes to the castle's bouquet. Dogs, cats, chickens, and occasionally even livestock would freely roam the Great Hall as if they owned the place. One medieval account describes a nobleman's prize falcon deciding to relieve itself directly on the dinner table, an event apparently commonplace enough to elicit little reaction. Archaeological evidence reveals that some castle floors contained layers of animal dung that accumulated over decades. Talk about indoor-outdoor living. The walls themselves were also part of the olfactory equation. Stone walls in damp climates tend to sweat, creating ideal conditions for mold. Medieval castle walls were often adorned with tapestries, not merely for decoration, but to attempt to contain dampness and mold. These tapestries, rarely if ever cleaned, became their own miniature ecosystems of mildew, bugs, and mouse habitats. The kitchen area was its own special circle of olfactory hell. Food waste, unwashed dishes, and constant cooking generated a smell potent enough to knock a vulture off a garbage cart. Because refrigeration was non-existent, meat was often kept until it was just shy of putrid before being cooked. The taste masked by copious spices, hence medieval recipes calling for spice quantities that would overwhelm a modern chef. Kitchen waste would be tossed directly out the kitchen window, creating what one medieval writer delicately termed the castle's own personal mountain of interesting aromas. But perhaps the worst culprit was the garderobe system, those castle toilets we mentioned previously. The design feature of these toilets was that they emptied directly down the castle walls into the motor castle ditch. In summer, this created what one medieval chronicler described as a most unique defensive system. The stench was so overpowering that some attackers actually abandoned their siege. Now that's what you call biological warfare. With all these delightful scents intermingling, it's no wonder medieval castle dwellers were always eager for outdoor activities. And speaking of outdoor activities, the castle's defensive training was about to commence.
Medieval castles were not just ornate stone mansions. They were the medieval equivalent of a nuclear bunker, replete with more safety features than a modern helicopter parent could conceive. The walls weren't merely thick, they were dare you to try something thick. Archaeological studies have revealed that some castle walls reach thicknesses of up to 20 feet at the base. Knights would actually train by attempting to shoot arrows through specialized slits in these walls, a task roughly as easy as threading a needle while riding a horse backwards. Historical records indicate some archers became so proficient at shooting through these tiny apertures, they could strike a target the size of a dinner plate from 200 yards. These were, mind you, the same individuals who couldn't hit the castle latrine in broad daylight. Speaking of castle defenses, let's discuss murder holes. Yes, the actual technical term used by medieval architects. These were holes in the ceiling above entryways from which defenders could drop anything from rocks to boiling oil onto attackers. One castle's account books from 1312 list 2 barrels of oil, 3 bags of quicklime, and 1 very angry beehive as defensive supplies. Clearly, someone got creative with their home security system. Everyone within the castle had a role during sieges, even children, who were typically employed as messengers or water carriers. Medieval records show that some castle children became so accustomed to siege conditions. Medieval records show that some castle children got so used to siege conditions that they turned it into a game. One account mentions children playing siege by throwing rotten vegetables at each other from different castle towers. The castle staff, unsurprisingly, weren't thrilled about cleaning up after these culinary battles. The moat wasn't just for show either. Beyond being a repository for all sorts of unmentionable things, courtesy of those charming castle toilets, moats were engineering marvels. Some castle moats were designed to be rapidly flooded or drained using intricate water management systems. One French castle boasted a moat that could be filled in under an hour, likely leading to some very bewildered attackers. "Hold on, guys, I swear this was solid ground just a minute ago." The truly impressive figure was the castle's drawbridge operator. This individual had one job: don't mess up. Historical documents recount several instances of flustered operators raising the bridge prematurely, stranding their own soldiers outside, or worse, lowering it at the wrong time. One particularly hapless operator in a Welsh castle inadvertently trapped half a cow in the raised drawbridge. The cow emerged unscathed, but it did generate what the chronicles termed a very awkward afternoon for everyone involved. But the most ingenious element of castle defense was the spiral staircases. They always curved clockwise going upwards, providing right-handed defenders with a distinct advantage in sword fights. The steps were also intentionally uneven, subtly different heights and depths, so defenders familiar with the stairs could navigate them swiftly, while attackers would stumble. Talk about home field advantage. One medieval chronicle even records an entire attacking force being routed because they tumbled down the stairs. Like a bunch of drunken geese. Defensive training wasn't solely about combat, it was about survival. Castle residents had to be ready for prolonged sieges, sometimes lasting months. They stockpiled food, weapons, and supplies as if their lives depended on it, because they did. One castle's inventory list included emergency rations of 500 arrows, 200 barrels of salted fish, and rather oddly, 3 juggling balls. Even in medieval times, apparently, entertainment was considered essential. The most successful castles were those that could outlast their attackers, which meant having enough provisions to feed everyone, from the lord down to the lowliest servant. After all that rigorous defensive training, medieval folks needed to unwind, and they certainly knew how to party, albeit in ways that might seem peculiar to us today. Take jousting, for example. You'd think colliding with each other at high speed with pointy sticks while mounted on horses would be perilous enough. But no, medieval people had to make it even more interesting. Records show that some tournaments featured novelty jousts where knights competed blindfolded or riding backward. Dice games were ubiquitous, despite, or perhaps because of, being frequently banned. Castle gambling was so widespread that some medieval account books had a dedicated section for dice-related debts. The games had wonderfully evocative names: Hazard, Cross and Pile, and everyone's favorite, God's Dice, which was apparently intended to lend a veneer of legitimacy to gambling in the eyes of the local priest. One castle record mentions a servant winning his master's prized horse in a dice game, only to lose it back, along with 3 months' wages on the very next throw. But the true luminaries of medieval entertainment were the jesters. These weren't merely individuals in funny hats telling bad jokes. They were medieval celebrities. A skilled jester could get away with saying things to the lord that would get anyone else summarily thrown into the dungeon. They had to be part comedian, part acrobat, part musician, and part suicide mission operator. Because making fun of powerful people was literally their job description, historical records indicate that some jesters were paid more than the castle's military officers, which really speaks volumes about medieval priorities. Music was also a significant part of castle life, but not like today's concerts. Castle musicians had to earn their keep by playing pretty much constantly. One medieval account lists a musician's daily duties as playing during meals, playing during prayers, playing during work, playing during something else, playing, and playing until everyone begs you to stop playing. The instruments themselves were quite something. They had something called a bladder pipe, which was exactly what it sounds like. A musical instrument fashioned from an animal's bladder. Classy. Lavish feasts would often feature something called a subtlety, which was neither subtle nor always edible. These were elaborate food sculptures, such as a pastry castle with live birds concealed inside that would take flight when it was cut open, or a roasted peacock redressed in its own feathers. One castle record describes a subtlety that was a life-size knight crafted entirely from marzipan, riding a horse made of roasted chickens. Medieval food critics would have had a field day with that one. All this entertainment kept the castle's massive staff busy around the clock, from servants scrambling to clean up after wrestling matches to soldiers trying to prevent drunken dice players from tumbling off the battlements. But that was merely the tip of the iceberg of their daily duties. Jobs in a medieval castle make modern workplace complaints seem utterly trivial. The coffee machine is broken doesn't quite compare to the dragon-sized bread oven is trying to eat Thomas again. A typical castle employed anywhere from 50 to 200 people, depending on its size, and every single one of them had a job title that would look completely ludicrous on a modern resume. Take the gong farmer, for instance. This unfortunate soul had the unenviable task of cleaning out the castle's toilets. But they weren't just any janitor. They were legally required to work at night, presumably to spare everyone else from the olfactory assault, and were actually compensated quite well. Records show some gong farmers earned more than skilled craftsmen, which really puts a new spin on dirty jobs pay well. Kitchen workers also had it tough. The average castle kitchen processed about 6,000 calories of food per person per day, compared to our modern 2,000. This meant cooking was a perpetually ongoing activity. Kitchen staff worked in shifts around the clock, and the head cook had the charming nickname of the Terror of Turnips in one castle's records. They also had specialized roles like the sauce maker, who did nothing but make sauces all day, and the turnbroch, usually a small boy whose sole job was to turn the spit over the fire. One kitchen account mentions a turnbroch who fell asleep on duty and inadvertently created the first extremely well-done roast. Guards had the most monotonous job until it suddenly wasn't. Most castle guards spent 99% of their time standing around looking imposing and 1% of their time running for their lives. The job also came with some peculiar requirements. Some castles mandated guards to sing while on duty, so everyone knew they were awake. One guard's log from 1387 records, nothing to report except Ralph's terrible singing, which arguably could be considered an attack on the castle's auditory sensibilities. The most prestigious job was being a knight, but even that came with some odd duties. Knights didn't just fight, they had to maintain their equipment, train squires, and attend endless ceremonies. One knight's diary laments spending 3 hours polishing his armor just to stand in the rain for 6 hours during a ceremony. Then there were the squires who spent years doing everything from cleaning horse stables to assisting knights in donning their armor, a process that could take up to 30 minutes and usually involved a lot of medieval cursing. Servants had the most diverse job descriptions. You had the keeper of the wardrobe, who didn't just manage clothes but was more like a medieval accountant, the chamber pot carrier, and let's not forget the wake-up person, whose job was literally to ensure everyone got up on time. The castle blacksmith had one of the most crucial jobs, repairing everything from knight swords to the cook's pots. One blacksmith's log includes repairs for 1 helmet dented in practice, 2 swords bent in anger, and 3 spoons mangled by the new kitchen boy. They also had to deal with endless requests for custom work. A 14th century blacksmith's complaint reads, "Lord wants dragon-shaped door handles again. Dragons don't even exist, but try telling him that." All this work unfolded under the watchful eye of the castle's true boss, the lady of the castle, whose job made modern CEO positions look like a leisurely stroll in the park. Running a medieval castle was essentially like managing a small city, a military base, and a farm, all rolled into one, and the person in charge of this controlled chaos wasn't always who you'd expect. While the lord was off doing lordly things, usually involving hitting other lords with pointy objects, the lady of the castle was the real MVP of medieval management. Firstly, these ladies were hardcore accountants. Medieval records show castle ladies keeping books that would make a modern CPA break out in a cold sweat. One surviving account book from a 13th century castle lists everything from how many eggs the chickens laid to how many arrows the archers wasted, shooting at birds instead of targets. There's even a note in the margins reading, "Note to self, stop paying archers when drunk. Terrible aim." Food management alone was enough to turn anyone's hair gray. Ladies had to plan meals months in advance, ensuring enough food was stockpiled for potential sieges. One castle's records show the lady ordering 2,000 salted fish, 500 chickens, and enough grain for bread to feed 200 people for 6 months, all while dealing with medieval merchants who probably thought expiration date meant whenever it stops moving. They were also medieval HR managers, resolving disputes between castle staff that sound utterly absurd today. One actual complaint record reads, "Cook refuses to work with John the baker because John's bread is so hard it can be used as castle defense." Another gem, 2 maids fighting over who has to clean the jester's hat after he fell in the moat trying to juggle fish. But these ladies weren't just shuffling papers. When their husbands were away, which was quite often, medieval lords loved a good crusade or war. They became temporary military commanders. Historical records document numerous cases of castle ladies leading successful defenses during sieges. One particularly resourceful lady in 1150 held off a siege for months by using empty wine barrels to create the illusion that she had more soldiers than she actually did. Talk about creative problem solving. They were also responsible for running the castle's healthcare system, such as it was. Most ladies maintained gardens full of medicinal herbs and had to know which plants could cure a headache and which ones might accidentally poison the entire castle. One medical record shows a lady's note. Reminder, the red berries are for healing, the purple ones are for getting rid of unwanted guests. Medieval diplomatic solutions were interesting. The lady's job included being a teacher too. She was responsible for educating not only her own children, but also the children of other nobles sent to the castle as part of their training. One teaching record includes a frustrated note, tried to teach young Lord William proper table manners. He still insists on using his sword to cut cheese. At least he stopped trying to juggle the bread rolls. Perhaps the most impressive aspect was managing the castle's finances. Ladies handled budgets that would make modern business owners break into a sweat. They had to balance everything from paying the guards to buying new tapestries, because medieval interior decorating was apparently very important. But even with all their management skills, sometimes these medieval boss ladies needed a break, usually when someone got sick or injured and needed to see the castle's resident medical expert. Although considering medieval medical practices, maybe expert isn't quite the right word. Headaches in medieval times weren't just annoying. They were an excuse for doctors to suggest the wildest treatments known to human history. Got a migraine? Here's some powdered emerald mixed with crushed rose petals. Can't afford emeralds? No problem. How about some powdered human skull instead? Yes, that was a real treatment. Medieval medical records show that skull powder was considered such a valuable remedy that some castles kept special cupboards just for storing their collection of therapeutic skulls. These castle doctors, or physicians as they prefer to be called, likely to sound more sophisticated than guy who thinks everything can be cured by bleeding, had some rather peculiar ideas about medicine. Their medical textbooks read like a medieval version of a horror cookbook. One actual treatment for fever involved shaving a chicken's bottom, strapping it to the patient's head, and waiting until the chicken looked sick because obviously the chicken was supposed to absorb the fever. Surprisingly, this treatment didn't make it into modern medicine. Surgery was a whole other level of medieval fun. Anesthesia wasn't really a thing yet, so the best you could hope for was getting really drunk before the procedure. Castle surgical records show that the average medieval operation took about 30 minutes. Having an off day? Let's remove some blood. Feeling overly joyful? Likely an excess of blood. Medieval physicians were convinced that practically any ailment could be cured by bloodletting. In one castle's medical records, a doctor prescribed bloodletting for a knight deemed too enthusiastic about jousting. The treatment seemingly had the intended effect. Maintaining enthusiasm becomes challenging when lightheaded from blood loss. The contents of a medieval castle's medicine cabinet would likely cause modern pharmacists to swoon. Instead of rigorously tested pharmaceuticals, they stocked items such as dragon's blood, unicorn horn, and mummy powder. Precisely what it sounds like. Pulverized mummies imported all the way from Egypt. A castle inventory lists 3 unicorn horns, 5 dragon hearts, in all probability lizards, and a single mermaid scale, likely fish remains of dubious origin. Dental care was a particularly imaginative affair. Experiencing a toothache? The medieval dentist, typically the same individual who provided haircuts, offered 2 solutions: tooth extraction or filling it with lead. Indeed, lead, as medieval populations seemingly lacked sufficient tribulations without the addition of lead poisoning. One castle record mentions a knight who underwent full dental extraction prior to battle, explaining he wished to avoid toothache distractions during combat. A definitive solution, to be sure. The most astonishing aspect of medieval medicine was its occasional efficacy, though probably not due to the reasons believed at the time. That herb-infused poultice applied to wounds? Some of those herbs contained naturally occurring antibiotics. Those unpalatable concoctions people were compelled to drink? The alcohol used as a mixing agent likely eradicated some bacteria. One castle physician's notes proudly declare that his proprietary cure-all mixture, composed of wine, honey, and sundry herbs, resolved everything from headaches to combat injuries. The wine and honey likely possessed genuine antiseptic qualities, even if his conviction of its effectiveness stemmed from stirring it thrice under a full moon. As night descended upon the castle, Even the physicians would put away their alarming implements. However, darkness ushered in its own distinct form of medieval entertainment. Ghost stories that would render modern horror films tame. Medieval castle nights made contemporary horror movies seem like harmless children's fare. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, these fortresses of stone morphed into realms of shadows, eerie sounds, and tales capable of eliciting chills in anyone. The fact that most individuals couldn't afford candles, each costing approximately a day's wages, meant that darkness was the prevailing force. Even nobles were frugal with candle consumption. A castle's expenditure logs reveal monthly candle costs exceeding the entire household's bread budget. Navigating a castle at night was akin to engaging in a perilous game of guess what you just stumbled into. Guards carried torches, but these often amplified shadows rather than diminished them, making every corner appear to conceal something sinister. One castle guard's diary entry from 1342 recounts, "Mistook Lord Geoffrey's new suit of armor for a demon, possibly screamed. Lord Geoffrey is displeased by sword damage inflicted on his expensive armor, now obligated to work extra shifts to cover repair expenses." Ghost stories were not mere amusement. Medieval people regarded them with profound seriousness. Castle archives indicate that certain locations even had formal ghost protocols. One castle actually instituted a regulation mandating that any ghost sighting be documented in a report detailing the apparition's attire. Medieval ghosts, it appears, were quite concerned with fashion. These reports, still extant, are unintentionally comical. One guard noted, "Ghost observed in North Tower wearing last season's tunic, quite disappointing. Suggested wardrobe update to the specter. Ghost appeared offended and vanished in a huff." The night watch held the most unnerving position in the castle. These unfortunate individuals were tasked with patrolling the darkest recesses, typically alone, armed solely with a torch and their own imaginations. Castle payroll records show that night watchmen received supplementary pay for patrolling specific areas notorious for uncommon occurrences. A watch captain's log entry states, "Hazard pay requested for East Wing patrol. Justification: suits of armor persist in self-rearrangement. Also convinced tapestries are sentient and observing. Further hazard pay requested for handling judgmental tapestries." Every castle of note boasted at least one undeniably authentic ghost story. Historical records present some remarkable examples. Consider the legend of the culinary ghost from a Welsh castle, purportedly crafting foul-smelling stews at midnight. The reality? Night guards attempting clandestine snacking and incinerating their provisions. Another castle reported a haunted library where books inexplicably relocated themselves during the night. The culprit? Rats, surprisingly, with a penchant for literature, especially partial to cheese-making manuals, according to the bewildered librarian. Yet medieval nighttime anxieties extended beyond just ghosts. They possessed an extensive catalog of nocturnal entities to dread. Castle bestiaries, medieval compendiums of monsters, listed creatures such as night crawlers, likely bats, wall demons, most probably mice, and shadow lurkers, almost certainly castle felines hunting aforementioned mice. Even the most seasoned knights were not impervious to nocturnal frights. One knight's journal contains a lengthy justification for assaulting a demon in the Great Hall, only to realize it was his own reflection in a highly polished shield. He purportedly spent the ensuing week avoiding both shields and the castle's highly entertained jester, who relentlessly reenacted the incident. The jester later composed a ballad about it, which to the knight's chagrin became a castle favorite. As eerie as the nights were, at least most individuals remained within the castle walls. The true horror show unfolded below, in the dungeons, where conditions escalated from mere darkness and furniture collisions to something far more sinister. Medieval dungeons were not the Hollywood depiction, replete with wall-to-wall torture devices and chains dangling ominously. In reality, the majority of a castle dungeons resembled exceedingly uncomfortable timeout corners. Archaeological investigations indicate that the average castle dungeon was roughly the size of a contemporary bathroom, albeit with considerably inferior plumbing and definitely no shower. Temperature readings from preserved castle dungeons reveal a consistent 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, meaning perpetual cold for inmates, but paradoxically, potentially superior food storage compared to the castle kitchen. However, should one find oneself within the dungeon's confines, it was prudent to cultivate influential friendships. Inmates were expected to finance their own sustenance and accommodation. Medieval prisons were essentially the world's most undesirable hotels. One castle's prisoner ledger documents a noble's complaint concerning his dungeon invoice. 7 silver pieces for rat removal? The rats remain. Demand recompense. The jailers riposte. Rats have been elevated to room companion status. No refunds. Another entry details an inmate endeavoring to negotiate a group rate, having persuaded numerous rats to cohabitate in his cell. Particularly opulent castles offered tiered dungeon accommodations. Envision a medieval penal class structure. Ground floor cells were the premium options, featuring actual windows and occasionally even furniture. Historical accounts from one castle describe these as suitable for nobles who have momentarily misplaced their decorum. Basement levels represented economy class. Dimly lit, damp, and with complimentary rat roommates, one jailer's journal entry states, relocated Lord Edmund to lower cell after persistent complaints regarding the vista. He now lacks any view to decry. Subsequently, he has composed 3 poems lamenting his lost panorama. Consider this a successful behavioral modification. Nobles unfortunate enough to be imprisoned often receive special treatment, though special is a relative term when one is still confined to a subterranean pit. Castle records indicate certain nobles even brought their personal servants to jail. One exceptionally fastidious duke purportedly insisted on retaining his food taster in prison, as prison foodborne illness was evidently his paramount concern. The food taster reportedly resigned after a week, asserting that gruel tasting in a dungeon was not encompassed in his original job description. The most prevalent dungeon inhabitants were not hardened felons, but debtors. Medieval accounting books reveal individuals imprisoned for debts as trifling as the cost of a quality cheese. One castle record mentions a man who endured 3 weeks in the dungeon for failing to remit payment for a haircut. The barber, with remarkable dedication to collections, apparently visited him weekly in prison to remind him of the outstanding balance and proffer another haircut at a special inmate discount. The prisoner eventually discharged his debt using earnings from providing haircuts to fellow inmates, a circumstance the barber found less than amusing. Escape attempts were surprisingly infrequent, not due to robust security, but because the majority of inmates were local. Where would they flee? Medieval communities were compact, and everyone knew everyone else. One failed escape attempt record reads, inmate John endeavored to abscond, disguised as a washerwoman, plan foiled by maternal recognition and subsequent ear-dragging repatriation. Another inmate attempted subterranean egress, but became disoriented within the castle walls, inadvertently breaching the kitchen pantry instead. Guards apprehended him while he paused to consume some honey prior to resuming his escape. The dungeon keeper's role more closely resembled that of an underpaid hotel manager than a menacing jailer. Their daily logs are replete with inmate grievances. Geoffrey desires a softer pillow, William laments the draft, and the merchant in cell 3 persists in hawking real estate to fellow inmates. One keeper lamented, requested reassignment to guard duty. The most peculiar dungeon account originates from a French castle where an inmate apparently inaugurated a thriving business conducting cell tours for visitors. The castle was compelled to institute regulations prohibiting inmates from levying admission fees for their own incarceration. The entrepreneurial inmate's rejoinder? He commenced vending souvenir rocks extracted from his cell wall instead. By the time of his release, he had purportedly amassed sufficient funds to purchase a modest dwelling, though the castle wall had developed a worrisome list. Despite these eccentricities, dungeons remained profoundly unpleasant environments. The damp, frigid conditions prompted even the most resolute inmates to wish they had simply settled their cheese debts promptly. Most individuals would undertake considerable measures to avoid dungeon confinement, including ironically adhering to castle regulations, which perhaps was the intended objective all along. And as daybreak commenced in the castle, both the unconfined and the incarcerated would begin to stir, preparing to embark upon another day of medieval mayhem anew. From the highest tower to the deepest dungeon cell, the daily cycle would recommence.